She was only 2 months old when they began filling her body with medicines that no one understood. Her father, a grieving millionaire, blindly trusted the doctor who claimed he could save her. Years later, a caregiver uncovered the secret. And now, with evidence in hand, the truth threatens not only the doctor's reputation, but his entire empire. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Now, on with the story. The Harrison Mansion was located in Bel Air, in the hills of Los Angeles, surrounded by high stone walls that seemed to have been erected not only to protect but to completely isolate that world from the rest of the city. It was an imposing 3-story structure, with large windows that rarely opened, and a garden that, despite the daily care of a silent gardener, seemed to carry the melancholy of one who is no longer admired. The century-old trees cast long shadows over the trimmed grass, and the silence that dominated the place was so profound that even the birds seemed to respect the pain that dwelled within. Inside that house, time had stopped on a day in March, 3 years ago. That was when Helen Harrison, a radiant woman of only 34, unexpectedly left this world, taking with her not only the light that illuminated that home, but also the soul of her husband, Edward. Since then, Edward had lived like a ghost in his own house, walking the halls aimlessly, occupying rooms, without ever truly being present. His eyes, which had once shone with passion and joy, now carried an emptiness that frightened even the longest-serving staff. Little Isabella was only 4 years old when everything changed. Now, at 7, she was a fragile child with large dark eyes that rarely blinked, and brown hair always tied in a simple braid by the hurried hands of some temporary nanny. Her small body was always wrapped in white cotton nightgowns, and her bare feet touched the cold marble floor with a lightness that seemed unreal. Isabella had been diagnosed with a rare neurological condition a few months after her mother's passing, and since then, her life had been reduced to doctor's appointments, endless tests, and a medication routine that occupied 3 entire shelves of a refrigerated cabinet in her room. But what truly imprisoned Isabella was not the illness, it was the emotional abandonment. Edward couldn't look at his daughter without seeing Helen. Every feature of the girl's face was a memory too painful to bear. So he distanced himself. He hired the best nannies, the most renowned doctors, bought state-of-the-art equipment, and ensured Isabella had everything money could buy. Everything except the presence of a father. Everything except love. The house was managed by Mrs. Amelia, a 60-year-old woman who had worked for the family for decades. She cooked, organized, paid bills, and coordinated the household routine with military efficiency. She was the one who hired and fired the nannies, who scheduled the medical appointments, and who, on the rare occasions Edward left his office, served him the black, bitter coffee he drank in silence. Mrs. Amelia loved that family, but she knew there were wounds that not even time could heal. The nannies came and went every few months. Some quit, unable to bear the weight of the silence that dominated the house. Others were dismissed for not being able to handle Isabella's episodes, when she would sometimes scream in the middle of the night, huddled in a corner of her room, as if fleeing from something invisible. No one understood what tormented the girl. Not even the child psychologists Edward regularly consulted seemed to have answers. They all said the same thing: trauma, unresolved grief, the need for an emotional bond. But no one could penetrate the barrier that surrounded Isabella. She didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't play. She just existed, like a porcelain doll kept on a dusty shelf. It was on an August morning that everything began to change. Mrs. Amelia received a call from an old acquaintance who recommended a woman for the caregiver position. Her name was Mary Costa. She was 32, originally from Pasadena, and had worked for years as a nurse at a private clinic. But something in her life had recently changed, and she needed a new beginning. Mrs. Amelia, tired of interviewing candidates who quit within the first few weeks, decided to give her a chance. Mary arrived at the Harrison house on a rainy afternoon. She was a woman of medium height, with straight black hair tied in a low bun, and deep brown eyes that seemed to hold untold stories. She wore simple clothes, dark jeans, and a navy blue cotton blouse. She wore no makeup, and her hands, though delicate, looked like those of someone accustomed to hard work. There was something in her gaze that caught Mrs. Amelia's attention, a mixture of sadness and determination, as if she were there not just for financial need, but for something deeper. The interview was brief. Edward did not participate as usual. Mrs. Amelia explained the situation. Isabella was a special child who needed constant care, infinite patience, and above all, discretion. The house was quiet, and Mr. Harrison preferred not to be disturbed. Mary listened attentively, asked few questions, and accepted the job without hesitation. Mrs. Amelia felt a strange sense of relief, as if something told her that this woman was different from the others. On the first day, Mary was taken to Isabella's room. It was a spacious room with walls painted a soft lilac that Helen had surely chosen with love. There were toys scattered on the floor, but they all looked untouched, like museum pieces. The bed with impeccable white sheets was against the wall, and next to it was an armchair where previous nannies used to spend sleepless nights. Isabella was sitting on the floor, her back to the door, staring intently at the window. She didn't turn around when Mary entered. Mrs. Amelia made the formal introductions and left, closing the door softly. Mary stood still for a few moments, observing the girl. She didn't try to approach immediately, didn't speak, didn't make any sudden movements. She just sat in the armchair, took a deep breath and waited. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was almost respectful. The first few days were like that. Mary would arrive early, take her position in the room and remain there, observing. She didn't force interactions, didn't try to make conversation, didn't invade Isabella's space. She was simply present. And in that silent presence, something began to happen. Isabella, who had never shown interest in previous nannies, started to turn her head slightly in Mary's direction. On the third day, their eyes met for the first time. It was a brief but intense glance. Mary smiled, a discreet and genuine smile, and Isabella quickly looked away as if caught in the act. Mary had a peculiar way of dealing with the girl. When she made the bed, she did it with a gentleness that bordered on ritual. When she adjusted the blanket over Isabella, she took a few extra seconds, making sure she was comfortable. When the girl refused food, Mary didn't insist. She just left the plate within reach and said in a soft voice, "It's here, Isabella, whenever you're ready." And then she would return to her armchair, pick up a book and read in silence, without any pressure. Mrs. Amelia watched everything from a distance, and for the first time in years she felt a spark of hope. There was something different about Mary, something the others didn't have. Perhaps it was patience, or perhaps it was the pain she also carried, a pain that made her capable of understanding Isabella's silence without needing words. Edward, for his part, had barely noticed the new caregiver's arrival. He lived locked in his office, a dark room filled with law books, scattered documents, and half-empty whiskey bottles. His work as a corporate lawyer had been practically abandoned. He only took on a few old clients, more out of obligation than desire. The rest of the time he spent in front of the computer, browsing aimlessly, or simply sitting in the leather armchair, staring into space. On the rare occasions he crossed paths with Mary in the hallways, Edward barely acknowledged her. She, in turn, respected his space. She didn't try to start a conversation, didn't ask questions about Isabella, didn't ask for instructions. She just went about her routine with a serenity that intrigued Mrs. Amelia. It was as if Mary knew exactly what she was doing, even without ever having received clear instructions. One evening, 2 weeks after her arrival, Mary was sitting in the armchair next to Isabella's bed, reading a children's book in a low voice. The girl was lying down, her eyes open, fixed on the ceiling. Mary didn't expect a reaction, she just read, as she did every night. But then, something happened. Isabella turned her head towards Mary, and for the first time, her fingers moved. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, but Mary noticed. The girl's fingers curled slightly as if trying to reach for something. Mary continued, reading, but now with even greater attention. When she finished the chapter, she closed the book slowly and looked at Isabella. The girl's eyes were closed, but there was something different about her breathing. It was calmer, deeper. Mary smiled, covered Isabella with the blanket and whispered, "Good night, little one." In the following days, the progress was minimal, but real. Isabella began to follow Mary with her eyes as she moved around the room. Occasionally, the girl would murmur something in her sleep, unintelligible words that Mary noted mentally, trying to decipher them. But along with these small steps forward, something disturbing began to reveal itself. One morning, while helping Isabella get dressed, Mary noticed that the girl flinched whenever someone approached from behind. It was an instinctive reaction, as if her body had been conditioned to fear the unexpected. Mary tested this a few times, always carefully, and the response was always the same. Isabella tensed up, her shoulders rose, and her gaze became distant, almost vacant. It was as if she wasn't there anymore, as if she had escaped into herself. Another thing that caught Mary's attention was Isabella's reaction to certain sounds. One day, while Mrs. Amelia accidentally dropped a pot in the kitchen, the loud clang echoed through the house. Isabella, who was in her room, began to tremble. It wasn't an ordinary tremor. It was something deep, visceral. Her hands clenched into fists, her legs pulled up to her chest, and she started rocking back and forth as if trying to protect herself from something invisible. Mary rushed to her, knelt on the floor, and without touching the girl, began to speak in a firm, gentle voice. "Isabella, it's okay. I'm here. Nothing is going to hurt you. You're safe." She repeated these words, several times like a mantra, until the trembling began to subside. When Isabella finally opened her eyes, they were filled with tears that wouldn't fall. Mary knew something was wrong. This wasn't just emotional trauma. There was something more, something physical, something that affected Isabella's body in a way that transcended grief or her mother's absence. But what? She decided to observe more closely. She began to make discreet notes in a notebook she kept in her bag. Times of the episodes, reactions to stimuli, behavioral patterns. Everything was carefully recorded. It was during one of these observations that Mary noticed something strange. Isabella took medication 4 times a day. They were different colored capsules administered by Mrs. Amelia, strictly following a doctor's prescription. Mary had never questioned this, but now she began to wonder, what exactly were those pills? She asked Mrs. Amelia for permission to see the prescription. The older woman, suspecting nothing, showed her a script signed by Dr. Albert Myers, a renowned physician who had been treating Isabella since the onset of her illness. Mary read the names of the medications, but didn't recognize any of them. She decided to research them on her own. That night, in her small room at the back of the house, Mary opened her laptop and began typing the names of the drugs. What she found alarmed her. They were experimental medications, some still in clinical trials, others with restricted approval for extreme cases of degenerative neurological diseases. The dosages prescribed for Isabella were far above the recommended amount, even for adults. And even more disturbing, many of these drugs had severe side effects, including tremors, behavioral changes, memory loss, and irreversible neurological damage. Mary felt a chill run down her spine. This couldn't be right. She decided to investigate further. The next day, while Isabella was asleep and Mrs. Amelia was busy in the kitchen, Mary discreetly entered Edward's office. She knew she was invading the family's privacy, but something greater compelled her. She needed to understand what was happening to that child. The office was an organized chaos. There were piles of documents on the desk, open books, and folders stacked on the floor. Mary began to search carefully, trying not to leave a trace. It was then that she found a folder marked with Isabella's name. Inside, there were medical reports, test results, evaluations, and several prescriptions, signed by Dr. Albert Myers. The more she read, the faster her heart beat. The reports mentioned experimental protocol, long-term pharmacological monitoring, and informed consent for clinical trial. Isabella wasn't just being treated. She was being used as a guinea pig. Mary photographed some of the documents with her phone, put everything back in its place, and left the office, trembling. She needed to tell someone, but who? Edward trusted Dr. Myers blindly. Mrs. Amelia followed orders without question. And Mary, a simple, newly hired caregiver, had no authority to confront anyone. But she couldn't remain silent either, not after everything she had been through in her own life, because Mary carried a secret she shared with no one but which had led her to that house. 3 years ago she had lost her only son, Gabriel, a 6-year-old boy who passed away after a sudden illness. The doctors said they did everything they could, but Mary always wondered if there was something more that could have been done. That pain had transformed her. She quit her job at the clinic, distanced herself from friends, and plunged into a silent grief that almost consumed her. But slowly she found a purpose, to use her experience to help other children. When she heard about the position at the Harrison house, something inside her pushed her in that direction. It was as if Gabriel were saying, "Go, Mom, she needs you." And now, looking at Isabella, Mary knew she couldn't fail. Not again. She had to save this girl, even if it meant confronting the entire system that surrounded her. But how? Where to begin? The answer came in an unexpected way. A friend of Mary's, Julia, was a pediatrician at a public hospital in downtown LA. They had studied together in college and kept in sporadic contact. Mary decided to call her, and without revealing names or details, described the situation of a hypothetical patient. Julia listened attentively, and at the end said in a grave voice, "Mary, what you're describing sounds like medical abuse. If this child is really receiving these medications, someone needs to intervene, and fast." Mary hung up the phone with a heavy heart, but now she was certain she had to act. That night, as she watched Isabella sleep, Mary made a decision. She would confront Edward. She would show him the proof, explain the risks and demand that the medication be reviewed. But she knew it wouldn't be easy. Edward was broken, clinging to the only hope he had left, Dr. Myers's promise that those drugs would save Isabella. Shattering that illusion would be like tearing away the last thread holding him up. But Mary had no choice. Isabella needed her, and this time she wouldn't let fear stop her from doing what was right. As the rain began to fall outside, pattering against the mansion's windows, Mary closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer. She didn't know if she believed in anything beyond the present moment, but right then she needed strength from wherever it might come. The battle was just beginning, and she knew the road ahead would be long, painful, and uncertain. But she was willing to walk it to the end, for Isabella, for Gabriel, for all the children who deserved a chance to live with dignity and love. And as the storm raged outside, inside that house, a small light of hope began to shine, timid, yet persistent. The morning dawned grey over Bel Air. A thick fog covered the hills, and the dampness seeped into the bones of anyone who ventured outside. Inside the Harrison mansion, the atmosphere wasn't much different. Mary had spent a sleepless night, mentally rehearsing how she would approach Edward. She knew she needed to be firm, but also understanding. After all, this man was drowning in a pain she knew all too well. But Isabella couldn't wait. With each day she took those medications, the girl was running risks Mary could no longer ignore. It was 7 in the morning when Mary knocked on the office door. There was no answer. She knocked again, this time more firmly. She heard a grumble from the other side, and finally Edward's hoarse voice, "Come in." She opened the door slowly and found the lawyer sitting behind his desk, his eyes red, a cup of cold coffee next to his computer. He looked at her with surprise and some irritation. "What is it? Did something happen to Isabella?" Mary took a deep breath and entered, closing the door behind her. "Mr. Harrison, I need to talk to you about Isabella's medication." Edward frowned. "The medication? What about it? Dr. Myers is one of the best doctors in the country. If there's a problem, talk to him." Mary knew this resistance was coming. "I know you trust Dr. Myers, but I researched the drugs Isabella is taking, and I found some concerning information." Edward stood up from his chair, and for the first time in weeks, there was real emotion in his eyes. Anger. "You researched? Who gave you permission to pry into my daughter's medical life?" Mary remained calm. "Mr. Harrison, I'm Isabella's caregiver. It's my responsibility to ensure she's safe, and the medications she's taking are experimental. Some aren't even approved for use in children. The dosages are far above what's recommended. Edward slammed his hand on the desk, making the coffee cup tremble. You're not a doctor. You have no training to question the treatment prescribed by a renowned professional. Mary took a brave step forward. I'm not a doctor, but I am a nurse. And I know when something is wrong. Isabella's reactions, the tremors, the exaggerated fear, the apathy, all of this could be a side effect of the medication. Mr. Harrison, please, just review the treatment. Get a second opinion. Run some tests, but don't ignore what I'm telling you. Edward stared at her for long seconds, and then something in his face changed. The anger gave way to fear. And what if you're wrong? What if stopping the drugs makes her worse? Dr. Myers said that without these medications, her condition could deteriorate rapidly. Mary softened her voice. And what if he's wrong? That question hung in the air like a sentence. Edward sat back down, running his hands over his tired face. You don't understand. When Helen passed, I was desperate. Isabella started showing strange symptoms. Seizures, loss of consciousness, episodes of confusion. Dr. Myers was a family friend, someone I've always trusted. He said there was a chance, a new experimental treatment, but that it could save her life. I signed everything he asked. I just wanted my daughter to be okay. His voice broke, and for the first time since Mary had entered that house, Edward cried. It wasn't a dramatic cry, but a silent, painful one, as if each tear carried years of accumulated guilt. Mary's heart ached. She approached slowly and, without asking permission, sat in the chair opposite the desk. Mr. Harrison, I understand you, I really do, but right now we need to focus on what's best for Isabella. And if there's a chance, even a small one, that these medications are doing more harm than good, we need to investigate. At least that. Edward wiped his tears with the back of his hand and looked at Mary with a mixture of desperation and hope. What do you suggest? Mary took her phone from her pocket and showed him the pictures of the documents she had taken. I have a friend who's a pediatrician. She can review Isabella's case confidentially. It doesn't have to be official. Just a second opinion. If she says everything is fine, I promise I'll never question the treatment again. But if she confirms my suspicions... Edward looked at the photos, and Mary saw the conflict etched on his face. It was the battle between hope and fear, between blind trust and the need to face the truth. Finally, he nodded. All right, but on one condition. I don't want Isabella to suffer. If we stop the drugs and she gets worse, I'm going back on it immediately. Mary agreed. Deal. In the following days, Mary began to gradually reduce the medication dosages, always under the remote supervision of Julia, who guided her, through text messages and discreet calls. Edward watched from a distance, still reluctant but trying to trust. Mrs. Amelia, for her part, followed the instructions without many questions, though she was clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Mary, she said one afternoon while preparing lunch, I hope you know what you're doing. I've worked for this family for 20 years. I don't want to see any more suffering here. Mary reassured her. Mrs. Amelia, I promise, I'm doing what's best for Isabella. And to everyone's surprise, Isabella began to improve. It was a slow process, almost imperceptible at first, but real. The girl started eating with more appetite. Her nights, once restless and filled with nightmares, became more peaceful. She began to show interest in things around her. She would point at objects, follow Mary with her eyes more actively, and, on one memorable occasion, held the caregiver's hand as they walked down the hall. Edward, watching these changes from afar, began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. But Mary knew this was just the beginning. Isabella's improvement was proof that something was wrong with the previous treatment, but she still didn't have answers about what had really happened. Who was Dr. Albert Myers? Why had he prescribed those medications to a child? And more importantly, did he know the risks? It was then that Mary decided to investigate more deeply. She started on the internet, searching for information about Dr. Myers. What she found was an impeccable record: a graduate of UCLA, with a specialization in pediatric neurology in Boston, director of a private clinic in Beverly Hills, and a member of several medical associations. There were photos of him at charity events, interviews in health magazines, and even a profile on a professional social network. Everything seemed perfect, too perfect. Mary decided to dig deeper. She spoke with Julia again, who had contacts in the medical community. "Julia, do you know anyone who worked with Dr. Albert Myers?" Julia was silent for a few seconds. "Why do you want to know?" Mary explained the situation, and Julia promised to look into it. 2 days later, she called back, her voice tense. "Mary, I talked to a few people. Dr. Myers has an excellent reputation, but there are rumors. Nothing concrete, but some colleagues mentioned he's been involved in controversial research before. Years ago, there was an investigation into unauthorized experimental practices, but he was never indicted. The cases were dismissed, and the families involved signed non-disclosure agreements." Mary felt a shiver. Non-disclosure agreements. Does that mean other children went through the same thing as Isabella? Julia sighed. Possibly, but it's hard to know. Those agreements are very well protected legally. If you want to move forward with this, you'll need concrete proof, and you'll face resistance. Mary thanked her friend and hung up, her mind racing. She needed more information, she needed proof, and she needed to understand how Dr. Myers had convinced Edward to put Isabella on that treatment. It was then that she had an idea. She remembered seeing a folder with old correspondence in Edward's office. Maybe there was something there that could help. She waited until nightfall, when Edward was asleep and Mrs. Amelia had retired to her room. Carefully, she entered the office again and began to search. It took almost an hour, but she finally found what she was looking for, a contract. It was a formal document, signed by Edward and Dr. Myers, dated 3 years ago. The title was clear. Consent Form for Participation in Phase 2 Clinical Study, Experimental Neuroprotection Protocol in Pediatric Patients. Mary photographed every page and read it carefully. The contract mentioned a partnership between Dr. Myers's clinic and an international pharmaceutical company. Isabella had been enrolled as a volunteer participant in a study aimed at testing the efficacy of new drugs for rare neurological diseases. In return, Edward would receive the treatment free of charge and be reimbursed for related expenses. But the most alarming part was in the fine print. The contract exempted the doctor and the company from any liability for adverse side effects and required absolute secrecy about the details of the treatment. Edward had, essentially, handed Isabella over as a guinea pig without knowing the real risks. Mary left the office trembling. Now she had proof. But what to do with it? Confronting Edward would be devastating. He was already carrying the weight of guilt for his emotional absence. Discovering that he had inadvertently allowed his daughter to be used in unauthorized experiments could completely destroy him. But hiding it wasn't an option either. Isabella deserved justice, and other children possibly were still at risk. That night, Mary couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her small room, thinking of Gabriel. Her son had passed so quickly that she never had time to question the treatment, to get second opinions, to investigate. She had simply trusted. And afterward, she lived with the doubt. What if there was something more she could have done? Now with Isabella, she had a second chance, a chance to do things differently, to fight, to not accept what she was told as absolute truth. But at the same time, she was afraid of getting too involved, afraid of getting attached to Isabella and losing her too, afraid that in trying to save the girl, she would end up destroying herself in the process. But when the sun rose the next morning, Mary had made her decision. She couldn't stay silent. She had to tell Edward, face the consequences, and, if necessary, report Dr. Myers to the proper authorities. Isabella deserved a dignified life, free from experiments and manipulation, and if Mary could ensure that, then all the suffering would be worth it. She waited until breakfast. Edward was in the kitchen drinking his usual black coffee when Mary entered with a serious expression. Mrs. Amelia sensed the tension and discreetly left the room. Mary placed the photos of the contract on the table. "Mr. Harrison, you need to see this." Edward looked at the images, and slowly, his face lost all its color. "Where did you get this?" His voice was barely a whisper. In your office. Mr. Harrison, did you know you signed a consent form for Isabella to participate in an experimental clinical study? Edward picked up one of the photos, his hands shaking. I didn't really understand what I was signing. Dr. Myers said it was just a formality, that the treatment was innovative but safe. He assured me he would do everything to save Isabella. I trusted him. He was Helen's friend, someone who was always there for us. His voice began to fail. I just wanted to help my daughter. I just wanted her to be okay. Tears began to roll down Edward's face, and he covered his face with his hands, sobbing. What have I done? My God, what have I done? Mary sat beside him, and for the first time gently touched his arm. Mr. Harrison, you were manipulated. Dr. Myers took advantage of your vulnerability, your desperation, but now we know the truth. And now we can act. Edward looked at her with red eyes. Act how? He's a powerful doctor, with connections all over the country. Who's going to believe me? I signed that contract. I gave permission. Mary squeezed his arm. We're going to report him. We'll find other families who went through the same thing. We'll expose what he did. And we'll make sure Isabella gets the treatment she really needs, not what benefits a pharmaceutical company. Edward shook his head, still in shock. You don't understand. If I report him, this will become public. They'll investigate. They'll question my competence as a father. I could even lose custody of Isabella. Mary looked at him firmly. Mr. Harrison, with all due respect, you already lost Isabella 3 years ago. She's been living in this house like a shadow, without affection, without attention, without love. You may have signed that contract, but you still have time to fix it, to be the father she needs, to fight for her. Edward fell silent, processing Mary's words. And then something in his eyes shifted. For the first time in years, there was determination. You're right, he said finally. I failed Isabella. I failed as a father, as a protector. But I won't fail again. We're going to report Dr. Myers. We're going to expose everything. And we're going to bring my daughter back. Mary smiled, feeling a wave of relief. Finally, Edward was waking up. Finally, he was willing to fight. But they both knew the battle would be arduous. Dr. Myers would not accept the accusations passively. He had resources, influence, and a reputation to protect. And when powerful people feel threatened, they can be extremely dangerous. In the following weeks, Mary and Edward worked together to gather evidence. They reviewed all the medical documents, made copies of the contracts, and spoke with Julia to obtain expert reports proving the risks of the medications. Edward hired a lawyer specializing in medical law, Mr. Roger Evans, a serious and experienced man who, upon hearing the case, was visibly shocked. This is extremely serious, he said. If we can prove that Dr. Myers was using children as guinea pigs without proper informed consent, he could lose his medical license and face criminal charges. But Mr. Evans also warned of the challenges. You need to be prepared. The defense will argue that Mr. Harrison signed the contract knowingly. They will question Mary's credibility, suggest she has personal motives, and they will try to discredit any witness who comes forward. We need to be strategic. Edward agreed. I'm willing to face whatever is necessary. My daughter is more important than my reputation. Meanwhile, Isabella continued to improve. She now spent her days drawing, something she had never done before. Her drawings were simple, but filled with emotion. A house with a sun, flowers in the garden, 2 figures holding hands. Mary cherished each one. She saw in those childish lines proof that Isabella was coming back to life. And more than that, she saw hope. Hope that, despite everything, there was still time to fix things. One afternoon, as Mary was arranging Isabella's drawings in a sketchbook, the girl did something unexpected. She picked up a colored pencil and wrote something on the paper. The letters were crooked, shaky, but legible. Thank you. Mary felt her eyes fill with tears. It was the first time Isabella had actively communicated. She gently hugged the girl, and for the first time Isabella hugged her back. It was a brief but powerful moment. And, in that instant, Mary knew that regardless of what happened, she had already won the most important battle. She had won that child's heart. But the road ahead was still long. The complaint was about to be filed, and once it was, there would be no turning back. Edward knew it. Mary knew it. And they were both ready to face the coming storm. Because now they weren't just fighting for Isabella. They were fighting for all the children who had been silenced, for all the families who had been manipulated, and for a system that needed to be changed. And together, they were determined to make a difference no matter the price they had to pay. The decision to go public with Isabella's case was made on a cold September morning. Edward, Mary, and Mr. Roger Evans were gathered in the office, surrounded by piles of documents, medical reports, and copies of contracts. The lawyer had spent weeks analyzing every detail, building a solid case that left no room for dispute. But he knew that the moment the complaint was filed, a war would begin. And this war would be fought not just in the courts, but also in the media, in public opinion, and in the shadows of power. "Mr. Harrison," said Mr. Evans, adjusting his glasses on his nose, "before we proceed, I need you to fully understand what is about to happen. Dr. Myers isn't just a renowned doctor. He has connections to politicians, businessmen, and powerful institutions. When we file the complaint, he will use every available resource to defend himself, and that includes attacking your reputation, Mary's, and, if necessary, questioning Isabella's own well-being." Edward looked at the lawyer with determination. "I understand, but I can't live with this guilt anymore. My daughter was used and I allowed it. If I do nothing now, I'll never forgive myself." Mary, who was sitting next to Edward, lightly touched his arm. "We're in this together, no matter what happens." Edward looked at her with gratitude. In recent weeks, Mary had become more than just a caregiver. She was an ally, a confidant, and in a way, a bridge reconnecting Edward to his own humanity. For the first time since Helen's passing, he didn't feel completely alone. The complaint was filed with the Medical Board of California and simultaneously submitted to the District Attorney's Office. Mr. Evans also contacted an investigative journalist from a major Los Angeles newspaper, Robert Taylor, known for his stories on corruption and institutional abuse. Robert was immediately interested in the case. "This is explosive," he said, flipping through the documents the lawyer had given him. "If we can prove that a renowned doctor was using children as guinea pigs with the approval of a pharmaceutical company, this will become a national scandal." But Robert also warned of the risks. "You're going to be attacked. Dr. Myers won't take this lying down. Be prepared." The story was published on a Monday morning. The headline was direct and impactful. "Renowned doctor accused of using children in unauthorized experiments." The article was detailed, citing Isabella's case without revealing her full identity, but mentioning other similar cases that had been quietly suppressed over the years. The reaction was immediate. Social media exploded with outraged comments, politicians made statements demanding rigorous investigations, and Dr. Myers's clinic was surrounded by journalists and protesters. Within hours, Albert Myers's name was on every news site in the country, but the reaction from the doctor and his supporters was equally swift and brutal. The next day, an official statement was released by Dr. Myers's press office. In it, the doctor claimed to be deeply dismayed by the accusations, which he described as baseless and defamatory. According to the statement, all treatments performed had followed strict ethical protocols, with informed consent and approval from the relevant authorities. He accused Edward of being a negligent father who, regretting his own failings, was looking for a scapegoat. And, even more aggressively, he insinuated that Mary had ulterior motives, possibly related to financial interests or emotional instability stemming from personal trauma. The offensive against Mary was particularly cruel. Within days, articles appeared on tabloid websites questioning her professional competence. Old photos of her were published, accompanied by insinuations about her emotional state after the loss of Gabriel. A television program even suggested that she was projecting her pain onto Isabella's situation, manipulating Edward to gain notoriety. Mary was devastated. She knew this was coming, but she wasn't prepared for the violence of the accusations. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if her entire life were being publicly judged. Edward was not spared either. Articles began to appear questioning his ability as a father, recalling the period when he had distanced himself from Isabella after Helen's passing. They insinuated that he was using his daughter to clear his own conscience, that he was emotionally unstable, and that the complaint was a way to divert attention from his own failings. Lawyers for the pharmaceutical companies involved filed defamation lawsuits demanding millions in damages. Documents began to mysteriously disappear from the clinic's archives, and witnesses who had promised to cooperate backed out, citing pressure and veiled threats. The situation became even more serious when, on a rainy October afternoon, a news crew invaded the privacy of the Harrison mansion. Cameras were pointed at the windows, reporters shouted questions from the gate, and a drone even flew over the property trying to capture images of Isabella. A terrified Mrs. Amelia locked all the doors and windows, while Mary took Isabella to the room furthest from the front of the house. The girl, who had been showing remarkable progress, was terrified by the commotion. She began to tremble, huddled in a corner, and covered her ears with her hands, crying silently. Edward, seeing his daughter in that state, exploded with rage. He stormed out of the house and in front of the cameras shouted, "Have you no shame? She's a child. You're scaring my daughter." But his words were edited and distorted. On the evening news, the scene was presented as "Unhinged father threatens journalists," accompanied by analyses from behavioral experts questioning his mental sanity. Edward returned to the house destroyed, feeling that no matter how hard he tried to protect Isabella, the world conspired to hurt her even more. That night, Mary stayed by Isabella's side until the girl finally fell asleep, exhausted. Then she went to the kitchen where she found Edward sitting alone in the dark, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him. He looked at Mary, with red eyes, not from alcohol but from pure despair. "I should have kept quiet," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I should have just accepted things as they were. Now, I'm making my daughter suffer even more." Mary sat beside him and took his hand. "Mr. Harrison, you are doing the right thing. This is hard now, but in the future Isabella will understand. She will know that you fought for her." Edward shook his head, the tears now flowing freely. "I failed her so much. When Helen was gone, I just gave up. I gave up on being a father, on being present. And now when I'm finally trying to do something right, it feels like I'm only making things worse." Mary squeezed his hand. "You haven't failed. You're here. You're fighting. You're facing all of this for her. That's what matters. Isabella needs a father who fights, not a perfect father." Edward looked at Mary, and for the first time, he allowed himself to be completely vulnerable. "Thank you. Thank you for not giving up on us." But the worst was yet to come. A few days later, during the night, Isabella woke up screaming. Mary rushed to the room and found the girl in a state of panic, pointing at the television that had been accidentally left on. On the screen, a report about the case was playing, with distorted photos of Mary and insinuations about her intentions. Isabella, who had been learning to trust again, looked confused and scared. She looked at Mary with eyes full of fear, as if she no longer knew who to believe. Mary immediately turned off the television and hugged the girl, but the damage was done. Isabella had a severe emotional relapse. She returned to isolating herself, refusing food, and trembling at any stimulus. Edward was desperate. "We have to stop this. She's getting worse. I can't watch my daughter suffer like this." Mr. Evans tried to calm him. "Mr. Harrison, I understand your anguish, but giving up now would be throwing everything away. We've come too far. If we back down, Dr. Myers will use it to strengthen his position even more, and Isabella, in the end, will remain an invisible victim." Mary also intervened. "Mr. Harrison, I know it's hard, but Isabella is like this because she was exposed to things she shouldn't have seen. We'll protect her better. We'll keep the house isolated, turn off all the TVs, shield her from all of this. But we can't give up. Not now." Edward spent the entire night awake, pacing back and forth in his office, torn between the desire to protect his daughter and the need to keep fighting. But when the sun rose, he had made his decision. "We'll continue, but we'll do it differently. We'll focus on the evidence, the legal proceedings, and leave the media aside. We won't give any more interviews, we won't react to the provocations. We'll focus on what really matters, proving that Dr. Myers is guilty. And that's what they did. In the following weeks, Edward and Mr. Evans worked tirelessly to strengthen the case. They gained access to internal documents from the pharmaceutical company, which revealed compromising correspondence between executives and Dr. Myers, discussing financial compensation for each volunteer patient recruited. They also located other families who had been discreetly silenced with out-of-court settlements. One of them, the family of a boy named Peter, agreed to testify even while facing legal threats. Peter's mother, Mrs. Lucy, was a strong and resilient woman, but also deeply scarred by what had happened to her son. Peter had participated in the same experimental protocol as Isabella, but his case had been even more severe. He had developed permanent neurological damage, and although he had survived, his quality of life was drastically reduced. Mrs. Lucy had accepted a confidential settlement years ago out of financial desperation, but now, seeing Isabella's case gain visibility, she decided to break her silence. "I can't live with this guilt anymore," she said in an emotional meeting with Edward and Mary. "My son deserves justice, and so do all the other children." With Mrs. Lucy's testimony and the new documentary evidence, the case gained renewed strength. The district attorney's office opened a formal investigation, and the Medical Board of California initiated an ethics proceeding against Dr. Myers. But the pressure on Edward, Mary, and the other families involved remained immense. Lawyers for the pharmaceutical corporations hired private investigators to dig into the lives of everyone involved, looking for any detail that could be used to discredit them. Mary, in particular, felt the weight of this persecution. She had become the most visible face of the complaint, and this had made her a constant target. She received threatening messages, was followed in the streets, and on one occasion found her car tire slashed with an anonymous note, "Give up while you still can." But Mary didn't give up. Every time she thought about backing down, she looked at Isabella and remembered why she was there. That girl deserved a chance to live fully, free from experiments and manipulation, and if Mary could ensure that, then it was worth facing any storm. Edward, for his part, was undergoing a profound transformation. The battle he was fighting for Isabella was reconnecting him to his own life. He became interested in his daughter again, began to actively participate in her routine, read to her before bed and draw with her. Isabella, sensing this change, began to respond again. She started to smile shyly, to accept affection, to show love. And, in an emotional moment, she called Edward Dad for the first time in years. Edward cried, hugged his daughter, and in that instant knew that regardless of the outcome of the lawsuit, he had already regained what mattered most, the bond with his daughter. The relationship between Edward and Mary was also changing. What had started as a professional partnership had blossomed into something deeper. They spent hours talking, sharing pains, fears, and hopes. Edward began to see Mary not just as Isabella's caregiver, but as a courageous, upright woman full of love to give. Mary, in turn, began to feel something she hadn't felt since before losing Gabriel: the possibility of rebuilding a family. But they both knew this wasn't the time for declarations or hasty decisions. First, they had to win the battle they had started. Meanwhile, Dr. Myers continued to defend himself with all his might. He hired the best lawyers, mobilized influential allies, and tried to discredit every witness, every document, every piece of evidence presented against him. But the evidence was too solid to be ignored, and, slowly, public opinion began to shift. What was initially seen as a baseless accusation was now recognized as a legitimate case of systematic abuse disguised as science. But Dr. Myers had one last card to play. In a press conference, he announced that he would sue Edward, Mary, and the journalist Robert Taylor for defamation, demanding damages totaling millions of dollars. The news shook everyone involved. Edward knew that if he lost the lawsuit, he would be financially ruined. Mary feared her reputation would be destroyed for good, and Robert, who had staked his career on this story, risked losing everything. It was at this moment of greatest desperation that something unexpected happened. Other families, inspired by the courage of Mrs. Lucy and Edward, began to come forward. They were parents who, for years, had kept silent out of fear, shame, or pressure. But now, seeing they were not alone, they decided to speak out. Within days, more than 10 similar cases emerged, all involving children who had been subjected to experimental treatments by Dr. Myers or his associates. The stories were devastating but also powerful. Each testimony was another piece in the puzzle that was slowly revealing the extent of the scheme. The district attorney's office, faced with the volume of evidence and testimonies, decided to accelerate the investigation. A task force was created to analyze all the cases, and independent experts were called in to review the medical protocols used. The results were shocking. In almost every case, the children had been exposed to unnecessary risks. The dosages were above recommended levels, and the informed consent forms were vague and misleading. It was a systematic scheme, fueled by greed and disguised as scientific compassion. When the news of the new complaints spread, Dr. Myers' defense began to crumble. Witnesses who had previously defended him began to back away, fearing association with the scandal. The pharmaceutical company, seeing its reputation threatened, decided to publicly sever ties with the doctor, claiming he had acted independently and without authorization. It was a desperate attempt to save its own image, but the damage was already done. The case was heading to trial, and everyone knew that this time there would be no escaping the truth. Edward, Mary, and Isabella continued to live one day at a time, facing each challenge as it arose. The mansion, which for so long had been a place of silence and pain, began to transform. There was laughter in the mornings, conversations in the afternoons, hugs in the evenings. Isabella was flourishing, and with her the hope that, despite everything, love was still capable of healing the deepest wounds. But the battle was not yet over. The trial was approaching, and with it, the chance to finally bring justice to all the children who had been silenced for so long. The trial of Dr. Albert. Myers began on a sunny January morning at the Los Angeles County Courthouse. The building was surrounded by protesters, journalists, and curious onlookers who wanted to witness what was already being called the trial of the century in public health. On one side, families held signs with photos of their children, demanding justice. On the other, supporters of the doctor, though fewer in number, defended his reputation, claiming he was the victim of an unjust persecution. The tension in the air was palpable, and everyone knew this would be no ordinary trial. Edward arrived early at the courthouse, accompanied by Mary and Mr. Roger Evans. Isabella had stayed at home under the care of Mrs. Amelia, shielded from all the exposure. Edward had insisted that the girl should not be present, not just for her physical safety, but for her emotional well-being. She had already suffered enough, and he would not allow the media circus to affect her again. Mary had fully agreed. Isabella was at a delicate stage of her recovery, and any disturbance could compromise the progress she had made. The courtroom was spacious, with dark wooden benches and an atmosphere of solemnity. At the defense table, Dr. Myers was impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit and a discreet tie. His face was a mask of serenity, but anyone watching closely would notice the tension in his eyes. Beside him, a team of 5 lawyers reviewed documents and spoke in low voices. On the other side, representing the district attorney's office, was Ms. Fiona Roche, a prosecutor known for her toughness and commitment to children's rights cases. She had studied the case meticulously and was determined to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Dr. Myers had committed serious crimes. The judge presiding over the case was Judge Anthony Davies, an experienced magistrate with graying hair and a firm demeanor. He banged his gavel, starting the session, and immediately set the rules. There would be no concessions, no shortcuts, and the truth would be pursued with all the seriousness the case demanded. The first few hours were dedicated to the formal reading of the charges. Dr. Myers was accused of conducting experimental medical procedures without proper authorization, manipulating informed consent, exposing pediatric patients to unnecessary risks, and criminal conspiracy with pharmaceutical companies for financial gain. Each charge was serious, and together they could result in decades in prison. and the permanent revocation of his professional license. The defense, led by the renowned lawyer Mr. Clive Fisher, tried from the outset to discredit the accusations. He argued that Dr. Myers was a dedicated professional who had followed all ethical protocols in place at the time, and that the families involved had consented knowingly and with full information. He further claimed that the doctor was the victim of a defamatory campaign orchestrated by people with ulterior motives. During his opening statement, Mr. Fisher pointed at Edward and suggested, in a veiled manner, that he was a negligent father looking for a scapegoat for his own failings. Edward felt his blood boil, but Mary held his hand firmly, reminding him that this was just a tactic. They had to remain calm. Ms. Fiona Roach responded with cold precision. She presented a detailed timeline of Dr. Myers' actions over the past 10 years, showing a systematic pattern of recruiting children from vulnerable families for experimental protocols. She showed correspondence between the doctor and executives from the pharmaceutical companies, in which monetary values associated with each clinical case were discussed. She displayed contracts that, while formally legal, were deliberately written in a confusing manner to obscure the real risks involved. And finally, she presented expert reports from independent specialists proving that the dosages administered to the children were far above safe levels, resulting in severe and permanent side effects in several cases. The following days were dedicated to testimonies. Mrs. Lucy was the first to testify. She took the stand with a face marked by pain, but also by determination. In a firm voice, she recounted how her son Peter had been subjected to Dr. Myers' experimental protocol, how she had been convinced that it was the only possible treatment, and how, over the months, she realized Peter was getting worse instead of better. She described the seizures, the episodes of unconsciousness, the neurological damage the boy would carry for the rest of his life. And, with tears in her eyes, she revealed how she had been pressured to sign a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for a financial settlement that barely covered the costs of the ongoing treatment Peter needed. "I accepted, because I was desperate," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "But I never stopped feeling guilty. My son was used as a guinea pig, and I allowed it because I trusted a doctor who swore to protect him." The defense tried to discredit Mrs. Lucy's testimony, suggesting she was being influenced by promises of additional financial compensation or by personal revenge, but the prosecutor countered with documents proving that Mrs. Lucy had not received any payment beyond the original agreement, and that her motivation was purely moral. The judge accepted the prosecutor's argument and recorded the testimony as valid and relevant. Other families followed on the stand. Each testimony was a story of pain, manipulation, and betrayal. Parents who had entrusted their children to a renowned doctor, only to discover they were being used in dangerous experiments. Children who developed permanent disabilities. Families silenced with out-of-court settlements. Lives destroyed in the name of profit and scientific ambition. The courtroom grew quieter as the accounts piled up. Even the most hardened journalists seemed shaken. When it was Edward's turn to testify, he took the stand with a racing heart. Mr. Evans had prepared him for this moment, but nothing could truly prepare him to publicly relive the mistakes he had made. Under the watchful eyes of everyone, Edward recounted how he had lost Helen, how he had fallen into a deep state of grief that prevented him from being present for Isabella, and how in his desperation he had blindly trusted Dr. Myers. He admitted that he signed the contract without reading all the details, without questioning, without seeking second opinions. And with a broken voice, he acknowledged that his emotional negligence had made Isabella vulnerable to abuses he should have prevented. "I failed as a father," he said, tears streaming down his face. "But I am here now to ensure that no other child goes through what my daughter went through, and to ask her for forgiveness, even if I don't deserve it." The defense tried to use Edward's testimony against him, arguing that he had consented knowingly and was now trying to shift the blame to Dr. Myers. But Edward responded with brutal honesty. "I have taken responsibility for my part, but Dr. Myers took advantage of my weakness, my desperation, to turn my daughter into a statistic. He is a doctor, a professional who is supposed to protect, and he betrayed that trust." The judge recorded the testimony and for the first time seemed visibly affected. Mary was also called to testify. She recounted how she had started working at the Harrison house, how she had noticed the alarming signs in Isabella's behavior, and how she had discovered the experimental drugs. She described the girl's progressive improvement after the gradual withdrawal of the drugs, and how that had led her to investigate further. She presented her notes, her conversations with Julia, and the documentary evidence she had gathered. The defense tried to discredit her, insinuating that she had personal motives related to the loss of her son, Gabriel. But Mary responded with dignity, "Yes, I lost my son. And that pain taught me to value every life, every child. It was that pain that gave me the courage not to remain silent when I saw another child being harmed. And if that makes me biased, then yes, I am biased in favor of life." The most anticipated testimony, however, was that of Dr. Myers himself. When he took the stand, the room fell into absolute silence. The doctor maintained his serene posture, answering the defense's questions with precision and confidence. He claimed that all protocols had been strictly followed, that the informed consent forms were clear, and that the families had been properly advised of the risks and benefits. He stated that scientific progress always involved a degree of risk, and that he had always acted with the goal of saving lives. But when Ms. Fiona Roche began her cross-examination, the facade began to crack. The prosecutor presented emails exchanged between Dr. Myers and executives of the pharmaceutical company. In one, the doctor wrote, "We need to accelerate recruitment. The company is pushing for more data, and the bonuses depend on it." In another, he discussed how to soften the language of the contracts to prevent families from being scared off by the real risks. "Ms. Roche," asked in a firm voice, "Dr. Myers, do you consider it ethical to prioritize financial bonuses over the safety of children?" The doctor hesitated, tried to justify himself, but his answers sounded evasive and defensive. With each question, the prosecutor tightened her grip, revealing contradictions, exposing lies, and deconstructing the narrative carefully built by the defense. The most impactful moment came when Ms. Roche asked, "Dr. Myers, would you say you loved these children, that you cared about their well-being?" The doctor, visibly uncomfortable, replied, "I always acted with professionalism." The prosecutor was not satisfied. "I didn't ask about professionalism. I asked about love, about care, about empathy. Did you see these children as human beings or as study subjects?" Dr. Myers fell silent, and in that silence the truth was revealed. To him, the children were a means to an end. They were numbers, data, statistics that would bring him scientific recognition and financial gain. And that dehumanization was the core of everything that was wrong. The final days of the trial were dedicated to closing arguments. The defense desperately tried to salvage what was left of Dr. Myers's reputation. They argued that he was a pioneer, that he had dedicated his life to medicine, that he deserved understanding, not condemnation. But Ms. Fiona Roche concluded with a powerful speech. "This is not a case about science versus ethics. It is a case about power versus vulnerability." Dr. Myers had power. The families, desperate and vulnerable, trusted him, and he betrayed that trust in the cruelest way possible, by using helpless children to enrich himself and feed his ambition. We cannot allow this to continue. We cannot allow science to be used as an excuse for inhumanity. And above all, we cannot allow children to be treated as commodities. The judge retired to deliberate, and the wait was agonizing. 3 days later, the verdict was announced. The courtroom was packed, with all the families present, holding each other's hands, praying, waiting. Judge Anthony Davies entered the room, banged his gavel and began to read. His voice was firm and every word carried the weight of justice. After a detailed review of the evidence and testimonies presented, this court finds the defendant, Dr. Albert Myers, guilty of all charges. The defendant acted consciously and deliberately, endangering the lives and health of dozens of children, driven by greed and ambition. His conduct not only violated the medical code of ethics, but represented a fundamental disrespect for human dignity. The room erupted in a mixture of tears and applause. Mrs. Lucy hugged Edward, both crying with relief. Mary covered her face with her hands, sobbing. Dr. Myers, for the first time, lost his composure. His face turned pale, and he leaned on the table for support. The judge continued, "The defendant is sentenced to 15 years in prison to be served in a maximum security facility. Furthermore, his medical license is permanently revoked, and he is prohibited from practicing any health-related activity for the rest of his life. The pharmaceutical companies involved will be fined and ordered to compensate all affected families." In the following months, the consequences of the conviction unfolded. New laws were created to protect children from experimental medical abuse. Ethical protocols were reviewed and strengthened. Independent committees were established to oversee clinical research involving minors. And most importantly, the families received the support they deserved: proper treatment for the children, psychological counseling, and compensation that, while not erasing the suffering, at least ensured a more secure future. The Harrison mansion also underwent a transformation. Edward decided to open the windows, let the light in, and turn that place of pain into a haven of hope. He and Mary, throughout those difficult months, had grown closer in a way neither had imagined possible. It wasn't a rushed or impulsive romance. It was a slow build based on respect, admiration, and genuine love. Edward realized that Mary was not only the woman who had saved his daughter, but also the woman who had saved him. And Mary, in turn, discovered that it was possible to love again, that it was possible to build a new family without forgetting the one she had lost. One autumn afternoon, Edward asked Mary to marry him. It wasn't a grand or pompous proposal. It was simple, sincere, made in the mansion's garden while Isabella sat drawing on the grass. "Mary," he said, kneeling before her, "you gave life back to me and Isabella. You taught us to love again, to fight, to believe. I want to spend the rest of my life by your side, building something beautiful together. Will you accept being my wife and the mother Isabella has always deserved?" Mary, with tears in her eyes, said yes, and Isabella, seeing them embrace, ran to them and wrapped them in a group hug, sealing the moment with the purity only a child can offer. Isabella continued to progress remarkably. Now a teenager, she had become a vibrant girl, full of dreams and talents. She discovered in art a way to express everything she couldn't say as a child. Her drawings evolved into complex paintings, full of emotion and depth. Teachers praised her sensitivity, and she began to participate in local exhibitions. More than that, Isabella decided to use her story to help other children. With the support of Edward and Mary, she created a foundation that offered guidance to families about the dangers of irresponsible medication and how to identify signs of medical abuse. The foundation grew rapidly, becoming a national reference and helping hundreds of families. Edward, who had abandoned corporate law, returned to the profession, but now focused on humanitarian causes. He became an active advocate for children's rights, working pro bono for families facing vulnerable situations. His personal experience had made him a more empathetic, more human lawyer, more committed to real justice, not just what was written in the law books. Mary, for her part, became the coordinator of a children's health program at an NGO serving low-income communities. She used her nursing background and life experience to train other professionals, teaching them to see beyond symptoms, to view the child as a whole, to question protocols when necessary. She knew she couldn't always save everyone, but she was determined to make a difference whenever she could. The house that had once been a mausoleum of silence transformed into a vibrant home, full of life, laughter, and love. In the mornings, the smell of fresh coffee filled the halls. In the afternoons, the sound of music and cheerful conversations echoed through the rooms. In the evenings, the family gathered in the living room, sharing stories of their day, making plans, simply being together. Mrs. Amelia, who had witnessed all the transformations, would say emotionally, "This house has a soul again." Isabella, now 16, was preparing for her first major art exhibition. The theme was rebirth, and each piece depicted a phase of her journey: the darkness of abandonment, the discovery of love, the fight for justice, healing, hope. At the opening, in front of dozens of people, she gave a speech that moved everyone. "I don't remember everything I went through as a child, but I remember the silence, the fear, the loneliness, and I remember the day everything changed. the day someone decided not to give up on me. My story could have ended very differently, but my father had the courage to face his demons. My mother had the courage to fight for me, and together they taught me that healing doesn't come from medicine, but from a love that doesn't give up. Edward and Mary, sitting in the front row, cried with pride. That fragile, apathetic, broken girl had become a strong, talented, and purposeful young woman. And they knew that despite all the mistakes, all the pain, all the battles, they had done something right. They had given Isabella the chance to live fully, and in doing so, they had saved themselves as well. The story of the Harrison family became a symbol of resistance and transformation. It was the subject of documentaries, books, and lectures. But for them, the most important thing was not the fame or recognition. It was the simple fact of being together, of being able to look at each other and know that despite everything, love had won. The cure didn't come from medications, but from attentive affection, the courage to confront the system, and a love that did not give up, even when all seemed lost. And as the sun set over Bel Air, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the family gathered in the garden. Isabella sketched, Edward read beside Mary, and Mrs. Amelia served fresh lemonade. It was a simple, ordinary scene, but one laden with meaning. Because there, in that space once marked by pain, life now flourished in its purest form. And they all knew that no matter what the future held, they would be together, facing every challenge with the strength that only true love can provide. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Edward, Mary, and Isabella has deeply touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of pain, courage, and rebirth, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment resonated with you the most. Every day we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul, making us reflect on love, family, and the strength that exists within each of us. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode with another story that will stir your emotions and touch your soul. See you soon.